Gavrilo Princip, a young Serbian nationalist, was fed up with Austrian rule in Bosnia. So in June 1914, he and a group of fellow Serbs decided to do something about it. Their plan involved assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When he visited Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, the mission was daring and dangerous. But Princip and his comrades were prepared to sacrifice everything for their cause. On June, the Archduke and his wife Sophie arrived in Sarajevo. As part of the royal entourage, General Oskar Podgorek traveled with them. He was in charge of security. Fortunately for him, the day was filled with snafus, starting with a bomb that exploded under a nearby bridge. As the Archduke's motorcade drove by, the car was damaged, but no one was hurt. Perhaps if things had ended there, the world would have been saved from a catastrophe. But this was only the beginning. As the motorcade made its way to the city's town hall, a second planned assassination attempt failed. Then they decided to head back to the safety of the Archduke's hotel. Once again, fate intervened. A third would-be assassin tripped and accidentally discharged his weapon, startling the Archduke and his party. They decided to take a different route, but this is where Gavrilo Princip came into play. He was waiting near the corner of Franz Joseph Street for a chance to carry out his mission. When the Archduke's car turned onto the street, Princip reacted quickly, drawing a revolver and firing 2 shots at close range. Both the Archduke and his wife were hit. They would both be dead within an hour. And thus, the First World War had begun. Okay, perhaps not yet. While the assassin fled, the general stood over the bodies of the royals, fuming. As soon as the news of the attack reached Vienna, the Austrians were ready to declare war on Serbia. However, the Austrians were still smarting from their recent defeat against the Italians in Libya. They were also aware that the Russians were rapidly modernizing their army. Not only did Austria lack the military strength to invade Serbia alone, but it might not even be enough to control Bosnia in the event of a wider conflict. So before declaring war, the Austrians went to Berlin to seek support from their ally, Germany. The Kaiser was eager to help, but he was more interested in showing his support than committing resources to the conflict. Nonetheless, he agreed to assist Austria unconditionally. This basically meant that German troops would intervene in the conflict once things got bad enough. With German backing, Austria was ready to declare war on Serbia. On July, they presented their ultimatum to Belgrade, outlining a series of demands that were impossible to fulfill without sacrificing national sovereignty. These included the right to send Austrian agents into Serbia to investigate the attacks, limitations on freedom of the press, and the right to station Austrian troops inside Serbia. To top it all off, they gave Serbia only 48 hours to comply. In reality, the Austrians knew that Serbia could never accept these terms, and what happened next proved that point. When the ultimatum expired, the Austrians began bombing Belgrade and other cities. Within a week, Austrian troops crossed into Serbia, while German forces pushed into Belgium to attack France and began marching toward Paris. By August, most of Europe was at war. So why did this conflict become so big? Why didn't the Germans or Austrians just stop after knocking out Serbia? It all goes back to how European powers kept getting dragged into larger and larger conflicts. As the fighting between Austria and Serbia got underway, the Russians wasted no time jumping into action. They had obligations to protect Serbia and their own Slavic cousins, not to mention the fact that they despised Austria for blocking their access to the Mediterranean. In fact, Russia had been preparing for war with Austria since 1911, so when the Austrians invaded Serbia, Russian commanders felt confident that they could win a quick victory and end the war before anyone else got involved. Unfortunately for them, those hopes were dashed in the opening battle between the two sides. At the Karansabes, the Russians thought they could easily defeat the Austrians, and so they deployed only 12,000 men, expecting a quick victory. However, the Austrian commander, General Svetozar Borovic von Boyna, was also looking for a decisive victory. He wanted to knock Russia out of the war before the rest of the continent got involved, so he massed nearly twice as many troops as his Russian counterpart. With numbers like these, the outcome of the battle was never in doubt. Even though the Russian commander, General Nikolai Ivanov, was tactically sound, he was ultimately undone by having too few troops. In the end, the Russians lost more than 3,000 men. While the Austrians suffered only about half that number of casualties, the loss was so severe that Russia couldn't afford to deploy any more troops. That meant the Russians would have to sit back and watch as the Germans pushed deeper into France. Even worse, the Austrians had done exactly what they set out to do, knocking Russia out of the war before it expanded. And now the Kaiser could finally start enjoying some spoils of war. So far, the war had been going very badly for the Allies. After all, they had lost one of their key members, and now the French were about to lose another. When the Germans attacked Belgium, they were supposed to only be doing it to distract the British. In reality, the British weren't planning on joining the fight. After all, they had only sent 80,000 troops to defend Belgium. However, that didn't stop the Germans from thinking otherwise. As the first German troops entered Belgium, Britain declared war. Unfortunately for them, the British underestimated how serious the Germans were. In reality, the Germans were prepared to go to war with everyone, which was probably for the best. Otherwise, they wouldn't have won such a massive victory. It started on August 4th, 1914, when British and German warships fought to a standstill in the North Sea. Then 3 days later, the Germans landed troops in Belgium. Despite being outnumbered by more than 2-1, the Germans pushed on. And by August 22nd, they had pushed the Allies all the way back to Ypres. Meanwhile, the Germans were also making rapid progress on the Eastern Front. They had managed to push the Russians all the way back to the Vistula River. At this point, it seemed like the Germans would win a quick victory and force the British and French to make peace. But then something unexpected happened. While the Germans were resting after their victory, the British were able to reinforce Ypres and launch a counterattack. The Germans tried to hold the line, but the pressure was too great and they eventually retreated. But just as the British were preparing to launch a new attack, the French began suffering from a shortage of ammunition. This was a major problem since their artillery was crucial for breaking through the enemy lines. Fortunately for the Allies, the French realized that something needed to be done and fast. And so they turned to the United States for help. As you can imagine, this put the US in a tough position because, at the time, they were still officially neutral. But the Americans were already heavily invested in the conflict. For example, many American companies were manufacturing weapons and other supplies for the Allies, not to mention the fact that millions of Americans had relatives fighting for one side or the other. But even if they wanted to join the war, they couldn't do it right away. After all, the US military consisted of only 200,000 men. It simply wasn't large enough to make a difference. So the Americans had to find another way to contribute. And that's why on May 13, 1915, Congress passed the law allowing the sale of munitions to belligerent nations. This was a massive decision that would change the course of the war. After all, with the help of the Americans, the Allies were now able to supply their troops with the latest weapons and equipment. For example, the British were now able to build better tanks, while the French were able to produce more artillery shells. But perhaps the biggest beneficiaries were the Russians, who were now able to replace their rifles, which had been largely worn out from years of fighting. And in the end, it all proved to be worth it. The Allies were finally able to achieve victory thanks to the help of the Americans. Click here to watch one of these next videos and learn more about how the US involvement changed the outcome of the war. Or click here to watch this video instead. Whichever you choose, I'll see you there.